Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Focus shifts, perhaps inevitably, towards the technology and techniques that the government seeks or will seek to employ in order to ease the impact, to ease the potential trauma of the loosening of the lockdown. All these words that we've hardly ever used before sort of slipped, haven't they, into our daily vocabulary, almost unnoticed. I don't know where to start on this one. John's on quite good form in a tweet here. He says, I'll download the government's NHS app if it comes with a free copy of the Russia report. That's not exactly helpful, John. And Ian raises a point that I have heard echoed elsewhere. There is zero chance I'm downloading an app that the government's mates have made. Why, when the Google Apple version have a version, did they need to develop their own if it isn't to use the data for other things? They even state that they will keep the data for research. And he adds a hashtag 1984. Let me stress from the beginning that I'm as new to this story as you are. There isn't really much of a bedrock of knowledge or understanding that many of us can bring to the table because it is all so new. And then I see interesting divisions of opinion from people who would perhaps normally find themselves on different sides of arguments. So a lot of people are wary of this app for what can only be described as surveillance suspicion. The idea that giving the government access to your movements in this way leaves you feeling a little bit chilly. Now, I don't know how long you've listened to me on the radio. If it's in the low single figures of minutes, then this next little contemplation is probably going to seem rather pointless to you. But I always try to bring my own angle to something based on experience and honesty mostly, before asking you to do the same. And I have to tell you that historically, sort of going back over my life, I'm always slightly surprised to realise that I'm quite compliant in a lot of areas. Like a lot of people, I like to think of myself as a little bit rebellious, perhaps. But when it comes to things like what I suppose you'd call public policy and even certainly medical issues, I've always been somewhat unquestioning in my acceptance of the authority, whether it's medical authority, academic authority, or whether it's actually political authority. So the government is in charge, and they are telling us that in order to be safer and to reduce the death rate, then we should do this. Ministers are hoping that up to 80% of all smartphone users, I wonder what that would translate to in terms of the whole population, will download the app. We'll talk in a minute about how the technology works, and we may well hear from NHS staff on the Isle of Wight who sort of today become the test cases for the entire nation. But you've already spotted some problems here, haven't you? I know you have. I don't have, and I'm really sorry about this, and for the record, I really wish that I did. But I have close to zero faith in this particular government's ability to prioritise public health over public relations. We've seen almost from the start. There is I almost hesitate to recommend this to you. But there's a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning, which is, you could read that and then read the British newspapers and be forgiven for thinking that they were describing different countries or different periods of history. Just to give you a flavour of what it says: biggest failure in a generation. Where did Britain go wrong? Even after a dire warning of 250,000 deaths under business as usual, the nation was not put into lockdown. Of course, so much of our media is still slavishly tugging the old forelock that they'll read that with a sense of disbelief and possibly even wonder. But this is what I've said to you all along. You can only base your trust in people moving forward upon how well they have kept your trust looking back. That's the only rational way to make these sort of decisions. Can I trust him? Well, let's have a look at his track record. Can I trust her? Well, let's see what happened last time we trusted her. And culture wars notwithstanding, it is impossible, I'm afraid, to portray Boris Johnson in particular as somebody who is trustworthy. Doesn't mean he won't be tomorrow, but looking back over not just the last few weeks, but his entire life, it's clear that he isn't trustworthy. And that gives me real pause. Because, with an awful lot of the stuff that they've done and the changes that they've made, you can't help thinking that there was an air of sort of desperation or haste involved. Why have you changed your mind? Why have you done that? Look at face masks, for a really small example, telling us for weeks they were no use at all, and then when it looked like we might have actually managed to get hold of a few, telling us that everybody should be wearing them. It's that fear that's been present from the start, that what they're telling us is not based upon the science, but is based upon the politics. And the politics, of course, have been very, very, very severely defined by the shortages. We know that now. So that's my problem. It's a problem of competence, a problem of faith in leadership, and a lack of clarity. But you may not have that. You may not be as au fait or as knowledgeable as I am about the track record of some of the key personnel involved, or you may be so, I don't know what it is, in fact, caught up in a sort of cultish admiration that you don't really care about what they've done in the past. You've got absolute faith that they'll get it right in the future. And do you know what? In a way, I almost envy you. But the way it is supposed to work almost demands a huge take-up rate. And I suspect that if we were to start making a list of reasons why you wouldn't take it up, the list would be both surprising and long, beginning with that simple question of competence. But you see, that wouldn't stop me signing up to it necessarily, would it? Because even if it doesn't work, even if it is another false alarm, even if it is another debacle, even if it is another faux pas, even if it is another failure of clarity and leadership, I don't see that any harm would be done by me downloading the app.
Because the countries who've been most successful in dealing with COVID-19 have tended to be those like South Korea, like Singapore, that embarked early on that scheme of track and trace, monitoring the movement of the virus through contact tracing and technology, understanding how and where it was spreading. The UK has come to this late, but recently with enthusiasm, launching an app that will be trialled on the Isle of Wight this week with the aim of limiting the damage a second wave of COVID-19 can do. James Clayton's been looking closely at the testing issues, and talk us through this new app, how it works, James.
Well, this app is supposed to get us, or help, at least help get us get out the lockdown. You're supposed to download it onto your smartphone, and essentially it works like a digital diary. So if I downloaded it and you downloaded it and our phones got too close, essentially both our phones would log that interaction and then memorize it. And the key thing that government are really keen to stress is that when you actually download it, you don't actually have to, you don't have to put your name, you don't have to put anything like that in. All you have to do is put your postcode in the first 3 digits of it, just so they know roughly where you're based, but that's it. If you have any symptoms, you can then essentially do a Q&A with your app. Your app will then tell you, look, you might have COVID symptoms, and then we'll ask you, do you want us to send that information that's currently on your phone to essentially a centralised hub that's part of NHS X? And then NHS X will then send all of your contacts a message saying, look, and this is anonymously, saying, look, someone that you've contacted has had COVID virus symptoms, you might want to quarantine or get a test.
This is all voluntary then. Are there privacy issues that come into this?
Yeah, I mean, hugely so. I mean, you would never, ever, ever do this in peacetime, but there are all sorts of problems and issues and challenges that come up with this. I wrote down a few so I wouldn't forget. Many people don't have smartphones. A disproportionate number of older people don't have smartphones. You need at least 50% of the population to take this up to be effective. The app won't work with other apps in other countries. The data you send you won't be able to get that back. That data is the government's. We don't know exactly who will be handling your data. Some people don't want the government handling their data, even if they encrypt it. And it's triggered by someone entering symptoms. So there could be lots of false alarms. But I think the key one that we've heard a lot of is the fact that it's centralised, because it doesn't actually have to be centralised. Lots of countries, in fact, most European countries, have gone down a decentralised route. And that is when, say, we're in the same position with my phone where you'd send it to the central database. Instead, my phone would do it. You'd bypass that and my phone would ping all of my contacts. The fact that the data in this model is held centrally raises alarms, because if data is held centrally, it's much easier to hack. There's more danger of mission creep from the government, where they might actually use that data in a malign way. So look, we definitely need this app. Does it infringe a bit on our privacy? Yes, it does. But does lockdown massively infringe on our civil liberties? Of course it does. So at the moment, it's not ideal, but we sort of don't have many choices at the moment.
James, thank you.
Now, tomorrow, the Isle of Wight will become the first place in Britain to try out a mobile phone app that could lead the country out of the coronavirus lockdown. The Health Secretary says NHS workers on the island will be the first to be offered the government's new contact tracing programme. The Scottish Government announced details of its own tracking and tracing system to try to isolate coronavirus outbreaks. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this report.
Isle of Wight Radio News at 4. The Isle of Wight is leading the way with the new contact tracing app.
The government hopes that half the population on the Isle of Wight will download the COVID-19 app, allowing the government potentially to roll it out nationally this month.
If you become unwell with COVID symptoms, you inform the NHS via the app. Other app users who you've had significant contact with in the last few days will then be sent an alert by the NHS along with advice about what to do.
You can play your part in the UK's fight against coronavirus.
The app asks for the beginning of your postcode and a health update. It's being launched alongside a test, track and trace programme, which the government hopes will also roll out nationally in a couple of months. The Department of Health said the app would start being available to some on the Isle of Wight, council workers and NHS staff, from tomorrow afternoon. The government says it wants 50 to 60% of the population to download the app, but says lower rates of download could still bring benefits.
I've got nothing to hide and I'm willing to download the app if it's available on iOS, Apple. But at the same time, what are they going to do with that data? Is this just a nice way of them to track me?
It doesn't actually bother me. I think with the current situation and people losing their jobs, I think the quickest way we're all back doing normality is a great thing for everyone.
The government acknowledges the app could struggle to reach some children and many of the elderly.
I will have a problem downloading the app. I don't download apps. If I really need them, I get somebody to do it for me. And then I have to understand how to access them. We have sophisticated phones, but we don't use them in a sophisticated way.
Order. Speaking on a link in a Commons debate, one Tory MP attacked the government's decision to go for what's called a centralised app, sending data to a central server rather than keeping most of it on the smartphone.
It is just an essential principle of our democracy and our freedom that we are not tracked by the state. And I think that the centralisation of this data is entirely wrong. And I think it should be, I would dump the centralised design and I would dump it now.
Do you see? I mean, I can't possibly make things worse for you, can I? Or vulnerable people by downloading it. Is that right? So I think that's probably the most important thing to remember, unless you can tell me how and why I've got that wrong. I now need to move on to some of the other reasons why you might not like it, but I've started with my own, which is if there's no risk involved, and the fact that currently I wouldn't trust a lot of these people to run a bath, if there's no risk involved, then I will close my eyes, cross my fingers and hope that they've run this correctly, and there's no real downside or potential negative in terms of public health. Is there, to me, downloading it and signing up? I don't know. Maybe you do. 0345 6060973. If you're in the field, if you're in the technology sector, if you have some understanding of some of the issues here that would perhaps not be immediately obvious or immediately comprehensible to lay people, then I'd love to hear from you. So, I mean, if we started that list, the first perhaps quibble, let's call it a quibble, would be competence and trust. But I think I've just talked myself out of that. So, competence and trust are reasons to perhaps be pessimistic about the likelihood of it working, but they're not reasons to opt out of doing it, are they? There could be technological reasons. When you read about it, especially if you know what has happened in other countries, because, I mean, again, I apologise if you don't like hearing this, but that's the problem with the truth, isn't it? It's often uncomfortable. If you look at our so-called lockdown, then it's a very watery and weak version of what pretty much every other country who's used that word lockdown has done. You know, we've heard this week about Spanish adults being allowed out to exercise for the first time in 7 weeks. So I don't want to do a watered-down pound shop version of what everybody else has done, and looking at our recent history, that seems to be what this lot specialise in. So give me a shout on the technology of it and whether or not it looks like it will work. Does it have as much effect coming on the back of a relatively weak lockdown as it would coming on the back of a very strong lockdown? And then after the technology and the efficiency, we move, I don't know, perhaps to the importance. So the way it works is anybody who thinks they've got symptoms gets tested. Anybody found to have it then has their... Don't laugh at me, all right? I'm going to try and explain it to you in my own rather middle-aged way. If you're found to have had it, then your phone will have tracked via Bluetooth your contact with all the other phones that have got the app, and they'll all be contacted to be told you've come into close proximity with someone who's subsequently turned out to have the test. And that means that they can get tested immediately, and I tell you now that the number of people with it who haven't displayed any symptoms is going to be huge at the end of this. I think most people are across that already, but a lot still won't be. So then you have this message going around to everybody, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, crikey, didn't Luke in Nantong tell us about this about 2 months ago? Didn't he ring us from Thailand when he fled the virus to tell us that he'd been getting messages on his phone telling him about people he'd shared an Uber with testing positive? And yes, you'd be right, and no, I don't know why so much water has passed under so many bridges in the intervening weeks, but we are where we are. If it is going to work to its best effect, then have we got the scale? Have we got the capacity for doing it? Because I don't subscribe to the school of thought that the Nightingale hospitals were an exercise in, well, we've got to do something, so let's do this. I think there's a really weird amnesia going on among people criticising the government for the fact that those hospitals were not used much. I want to know, this is a question on my list which I may ask you later this week, I want to know why care home patients weren't moved into those Nightingale hospitals, and ideally I'd like to know now, but that's not a question I'm asking you yet. But they were there in case we needed them. Again, I could be wrong, and a lot of people I admire and normally agree with are suggesting that there was some PR exercise in, but I don't think there was. I think we were terrified of having an Italy-type situation with ICUs overflowing and ventilators at a premium, and they did a really good job building hospitals to address that possibility. The possibility didn't come along. I don't think we should give them a coating for addressing it. So there you go. There's some warm words for some elements of what the government has done. But a lot of the other stuff they've done does look like they have sort of just concluded, well, we've got to do something, make an announcement, do this, do that. What's the phrase? Following the science. And I look at this app and I just don't know. All right? And also, you may be concerned about the rhetoric, which is moving from optional to duty. You know, the talk of duty. You have a duty to download the app. This is how the Times report it, and this won't be an accident. In echoes of the stay-at-home campaign, the public will be told that it is their duty to download the app to protect their health and that of their family and friends. Okay, 16 minutes after 10. As things stand, this bloke, me, here, this bloke will download it, but he's not got an enormous amount of faith that it will do the job that it's designed to do because of the track record of the people behind it. That's my position, all right? Tell me why I shouldn't download it. I don't think you can tell me why I should have more faith, but if you think you can, I'll bite your arm off. Tell me why I shouldn't download it, well, or tell me why you wouldn't. Because I would once have laughed at you for talking about surveillance. I remember when people said they'd never get an Oyster card because they didn't want the powers that be to know how they were moving around London. And I just thought to myself, well, you're not that important, mate. You know, you work in a sandwich shop. But given what's happened in Britain and America in recent years, in America in particular, seeing that a Western liberal democracy can lurch with a monster at its helm, can lurch towards fascism, and this is the bit I don't think any of us understood when we were reading about the 1930s. It can lurch towards fascism with half of the population cheering. So I do now have worries about what governments might do with data and power, where once I would just have trusted them to do the decent thing. So I'm going to download it with a modicum of optimism, but not much. unless you can tell me why I shouldn't. And I don't want to have a scrap with anybody today. I think we all, apart from a few ghouls writing for the usual organs, we all just want to minimise the death rates. We just want as few people as possible to die as a result of this virus. That is the top priority. That is the abiding ambition. And that is why I would download it. Why wouldn't you? Why shouldn't I? Why won't you? Clarity and leadership is what we are looking for, what we have been looking for all along. I don't know whether or not it's going to be rolled out in some cities and not in others. Northern cities, according to The Sun today, are angry about plans to keep them in lockdown for longer than the southeast. I don't know whether this app will work. I don't know whether the suggestions for how we might return to work will make sense to you when I tell you what they've got in mind for your workplace. But we've only got one government, so when they tell you to download an app, will you? 0345 606 0973. Before we get stuck into that, Rachel Venables, LBC's correspondent, is here to give us a quick heads up on the latest ONS figures. Rachel, what do we know?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, James. There is some good news, slight good news, as pointing to an overall decline possibly in the number of deaths being caused by coronavirus from these figures from the Office for National Statistics published this morning at 9:30. They've looked at the deaths registered in England and Wales in the week ending the 24th of April. That's known as week 17. There is obviously a slight lag because it takes them 11 days to fully go through this data. Now, in that week, there were 21,000 deaths, still much higher than we would normally expect to see at this time of year, but it was a slight decrease on the previous week by 354 deaths. That's the first decrease we've actually seen in quite a few weeks, not since March. Every week, the number of total deaths in England and Wales has been going up. So to see the numbers starting to go down, obviously a good sign, though we are still seeing thousands more deaths than we would normally expect to see. Also, of the deaths that were registered in that week, just over 8,000 mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, 37% of all deaths. Again, that is a slight decrease on the week before, where 39% of all deaths mentioned coronavirus, so 500 fewer taking place in that week. As I say, they are slight signs. Certainly it's good they're not going up, but we are still talking about huge numbers of people here who have been losing their lives. Sadly, also what we can see in these numbers, another rise in the weekly numbers of deaths involving care homes. The total for that week, 2,700. That was up from 2,050 the week before, so an increase of 36%. So while deaths in hospitals seem to be holding steady or even going down, the number of care homes continuing to rise. And just another thing to point out to you, a really grim milestone, in fact. In England, they say here that according to the total number of deaths registered up to the 2nd of May, they've got 28,000 deaths. Now, when you combine that with the total number of deaths we know have happened in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that would put us to over 30,000 deaths in the UK, a really grim milestone, particularly when you consider that we were told initially that to keep the death tally under 20,000 would be a, quote, good result.
Rachel Venables, many thanks indeed. And that reminder there at the end of perhaps another of the reasons why people are a little bit short on trust, however much they may want to believe. You can believe in an undefined, relatively meaningless word like Brexit, but you can't believe in a response to a virus unless the science is real. So, I mean, the problem is, Will Guyatt, who often talks on LBC about matters technological, has explained you need a take-up rate in excess of 50% of the population for it to be effective. So if it doesn't hit those sort of numbers, and as things stand, I can't see that it would, then they do actually get to harvest a load of data. And this government, despite many attempts to pretend otherwise, kind of came to power on the back of a massive data harvesting exercise when the people running the government were running the Vote Leave campaign. And that will give cause for concern. But nobody's more sceptical about the Vote Leave lot than I am. And I still, at this point, can't see any reason not to download it, just in case it works. That seems to me to be the way to best reflect the national interest. But let's find out what you think. Will's in Maidstone. Will, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Big fan of the show.
Thank you.
I would just want to say that, unfortunately, despite knowing how important tracing is going to be, there's no chance I'm going to download this app as it stands. I'm almost at the point of thinking I might even proactively try and tell my friends not to as well, just because I don't trust this government, and particularly Dominic Cummings, with data in the slightest. Because
why not? And can you answer this question in a way that will perhaps chime with people who don't know anything about, for example, Cambridge Analytica?
That was the next thing I was going to say.
I thought it might be, but that some people they don't switch off necessarily, but it hasn't cut through, largely because there's only about 2 or 3 journalists in the entire country who've been reporting it accurately. But just don't use words like that. Describe what you think they have, not them necessarily, but what you think has been done, rather than who has done it, if that helps.
Okay. Well, what I'm particularly worried about with this app in this case is, if it's not independently run, then all the health data they can be gathering from people could be used with malicious intent, for example, in another election, where it's used to make targeted ads on social media. So if you've got a particular health condition that makes you think a certain way about the world, they'll be able to find you out specifically and show you ads that no other person can see, will be personalised to you, which might sway your opinion, and it's shown that these things can sway elections. So can
we put some flesh on the bones of that fear? Give me a theoretical example of how that might play out.
So how do you mean?
Well, I was just trying to think of what the advert might look like. I think, and this would pull us back towards, so if we don't know what medical data is going to be recorded, do we? Is it not just, but you're talking about if you're at risk and that sort of thing, then it will be harvested somehow. And then you might get a message, for example, saying, and most people won't be susceptible, well, many people won't be susceptible to this, but we look back at what happened in 2016, and you might get a message, for example, if you were a diabetic with a British name, you might get a message saying 500 Romanian diabetics got prescriptions last, and that I mean, that's a really notional theoretical example, but is that the kind of thing we're worrying about?
Yeah, and I think, unless the government make this app open source or show the public what data protection stuff they're going to put in place, let it be independently audited, I don't see a way around that.
Okay. This is a problem, isn't it? This is where I'm being a little bit Pollyanna-ish, because I'm saying I wouldn't trust this lot as far as I can throw them, but I can't really see any downside to downloading this app and just crossing my fingers and hoping that it helps. But you're saying it is precisely because you don't trust them that you wouldn't download the app, and although our examples may sound a little fanciful, I couldn't argue that they were more fanciful than stuff that has actually already happened. What if they promise? Don't laugh at me, all right? Promise me you won't laugh at me?
Okay.
You don't sound very... You see, you've already broken your promise. You just laughed.
Sorry.
But if they made it really clear beforehand that they wouldn't do X, Y, and Z, would that reassure you at all?
Well, if they let an outside or independent organisation check on them in some way, maybe.
Okay. And at the moment they're not doing that. And before you go, what is your, because I think you know more about this than, or perhaps you understand more than I do, what is your understanding of who will be running it, and why do people keep telling me about the Google Apple alternative that the government has turned down, if that's correct?
I'm not sure about the truth of this, but what I've read is that the government awarded a contract to someone linked to them. I think it might be someone linked to Dominic Cummings. I don't know there's complete truth in that.
Okay, no, that's fine. At least you're honest. I'd rather have people admit that they don't know than come on and state with certainty things that subsequently turn out not to be true. Well, I can't really argue with you on the question of whether or not you should trust this lot, because without blowing my own trumpet, I've done more than a lot of people to chronicle the reasons not to. But I don't join you yet in worrying that they'd use that data. Well, they couldn't get you with it, could they? So whether you sign up to it or not is not going to affect the potential problem that you describe, them going after susceptible stroke vulnerable people with bespoke political ideology, but then nobody thinks they're susceptible to bespoke political ideology. That's been the whole flipping problem with this story from the start. Is, yeah, I got those emails, but that's not why I voted the way I voted. It had nothing to do with Auntie Doris's Facebook messages. Will, thank you. It's a nice start. It's coming up to 10:30. I'll take anything on this. I find it absolutely riveting. And I don't know about you, but I'm strangely refreshed by the lack of a necessity to have a really pungent opinion on this today. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need if you want to join this exercise in turning up the lights. It's 10:30. My sort of cautious acquiescence is how I would describe it, is already under siege. The first caller pointing out that the issue of trust, and of course anybody who's followed events closely since 2016 has very, very deep cause not to trust the current cabal at the heart of Downing Street, the sort of Downing-Tufton Street cabal with Dominic Cummings at the helm. That's not a matter of opinion, that's a matter of fact. There are lots and lots of reasons to be suspicious of how they conduct themselves. It's not that long ago that Cummings was in contempt of Parliament and Vote Leave was found guilty of breaching electoral law. So why would you give them your details? Answer, because I can't think of anything they could do with my details that would be harmful. But that's already looking a bit wobbly after the first call. I suspect it's going to wobble still further after we talk to Matthew Ryder from the Matrix Chambers, a barrister there who I heard, I won't pretend, Matthew, that I heard you elsewhere this morning, being incredibly articulate and rather worrying, so I'm hoping that you'll reprise that for me now. What are your concerns?
Oh, well, we published an opinion, a group of lawyers, barristers from different chambers, a solicitor from a established data rights solicitors firm called AWO, published a joint opinion in which we expressed our concern over what's being done with the government plan. And to put it in really simple terms, there are two options the government could have taken. They could have had a centralised app, which is what they're going for, where the data is largely contained centrally. Once you give them the information, they put it in a central place, and they have the potential at least to combine it with other information and get more information about how we contact each other, versus a decentralised system, which is what Germany, Austria, Italy, maybe the US and various others are using, which is much more secure, has much less interference with your privacy, and where the data really always stays on device.
Right. So,
our question, yes. Sorry, just to explain it, our question is, for the government, why are you opting for the system which interferes with your privacy more to achieve the same things that these other countries are achieving when they're going for the system which interferes with your privacy less? And it's for the government to explain to us why they think they need a system that those other countries think they don't need.
How, I mean, are these systems transferable? Could we just sign up to essentially the same system that the Germans have employed or the South Koreans?
They tend to operate on sort of models, and what's really interesting is that Apple and Google a couple of weeks ago published a protocol, because they're the developers of the two main phone systems, iPhones and Android phones. Yes. And they published a protocol. I think what's really interesting about this is that if Apple and Google, who are well known for in good ways and bad ways for knowing how to secure our data, how to gather our data, how to... If they're both saying by implication the only safe way to do this is a decentralized system, which is what they are advocating for governments to adopt. If Google and Apple are saying that's the safe way to do this, then you've got to wonder why the UK government think we know better than Apple and Google about their own phones. And in our view, we think our system is going to be just as safe as the one they are saying that we should adopt. And Germany, Austria and others are adopting the Apple and Google initiative and going to decentralised. Sorry.
I'll leave this question hanging. I just wonder if there's a simpler word than decentralised, but we can come back to that.
On device.
Right. So everything would be sent to a hub under the British government's proposal, whereas as it stands, everything would stay on my phone until they needed it.
Yeah, so the difficulty is that some of this is quite complicated, so you can try and simplify it as much as possible, but there's a bottom line or limit to how far you can simplify it. But to put it in simple terms, both systems, the data initially is on your phone, and at some point you trigger it. But in the current system that the government are trying to use, once you trigger it, it then goes centrally. They can then look at it. They notify the people you've been in contact with. They're the ones who have the potential to combine it with other information. But in an on-device system, in the decentralized system, you'd effectively notify other people through your phone. It might go through a system, but you trigger
or even your phone does it. You wouldn't have to do anything yourself. Your phone does the notification.
Your phone notifies the phones that have been close to yours. And the system is entirely deliberately designed to make it very, very difficult to combine it with other information. And the people who've designed the system, a group of scientists, data scientists who designed the system, have said, look, if you want increased functionality to help government plan, and we all want this to work, we all want the government to get this right, we all want the government to protect our lives, we all want this to work. And so they're saying if the government want more functionality, there are ways you can do that with an on-device system. There are simple ways you can do that. There's added functionality you can add, but you don't need a centralized system to do it. And that's what the concern is. We don't understand at the moment why the government has opted for the central system rather than an on-device system.
And they need to tell us.
Yeah, I mean, the way that, just so people understand the way the legal process works, is that if you're a government and you're interfering with people's rights, whether it's privacy or anything else, the burden is on you, the government, to explain why. Now, you may be able to justify it. The government may well be able to. Yeah, the government may well be able to say, we've got good reasons for it. This is why we think we should do it. And of course, if they can present good reasons, we should respect that. But the process at this time is incomplete. They haven't produced those reasons, and the problem is it doesn't match with those other countries who say, we can do the same thing, we care about our citizens, we can do the same thing, but we don't need to do it in the way you're doing it.
And the reason why you sort of said something along the lines of for good or for ill earlier when you were describing Apple and Google's role in this process is that, of course, they have been criticised for being too protective of customers' data in the past, particularly in the context of crime. So if they're saying this, then it adds extra weight when you look at their track record in similar spheres. Who's behind then, Matthew, the British scheme? Who because one sees worries being expressed on social media and one's never entirely sure how justified they are. So what do we know about the individuals or the institutions, the companies that the British government is minded to trust with this project?
Well, I think NHSX, which is the digital development arm of the NHS, have really been driving this. They have a board who they're working with. You've got to be fair to them. They've been working quite hard with data ethics boards. They've been working very hard with the Information Commissioner. So they are trying to do the right thing. I don't think I think it's probably unfair to start imputing bad motives towards this. They're opting for a system which they think gives them more power and more functionality. But our concern is that in doing so, there are two problems. The first one is they're interfering with our privacy and creating risks about our privacy more than they might need to, and they need to justify that. I think the second concern, though, is probably one that your listeners will understand quite well, which is that if they are opting for the system which interferes with your privacy more, that's going to make people more uncomfortable to install it. And that's going to mean that it might be less effective because less people feel confident about it. And so there is a huge advantage, just in terms of efficiency, in saying we're going for the least intrusive system, the same ones they're going for in Germany.
It would increase efficacy.
Absolutely. Then everybody would say, OK, we know we're going for the system that protects our privacy the most, and we're comfortable with that. And we've said in our legal opinion that, aside from a few questions about how the system would operate, by and large, we think that once you can show that smartphone contract system works, the decentralized system is likely to comply with human rights law and data law, which would
address all of your concerns.
Exactly, and so it's not just a legal thing; it's also about public confidence.
Yes, and well, public health. Just to clarify then, and I'm glad you said that. I'm glad that you sort of have said we shouldn't impute negative motives, but just to address people listening to this who already have, this AI startup that worked with Dominic Cummings on the Vote Leave campaign, run by a chap called Mark Warner, who has attended a meeting of the government scientific advisory group on emergencies for reasons that aren't entirely clear. They're already in receipt, I think, of 7 government contracts. Their first big one was that Vote Leave gig. That's a red herring in the context of what you're concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know the details of the... But what I would say is, we've got to be careful about getting into the idea of goodies and baddies in this area. Everybody's trying to produce...
We want the best kit possible, don't we, really?
Totally.
That's what everybody should want.
I've heard people saying, for example... their concerns about Google and Apple intervening in this debate. And when you actually go into the detail, what Apple and Google have tried to do, whatever criticisms you might make of them in other contexts, has been a very constructive entry into this debate. So characterising firms or individuals or their associates as goodies and baddies when we're actually all trying to do this together, I think is a little bit dangerous.
Yes, I'm inclined to agree, even if it does involve a slight... compulsion to ignore track records, as you point out, with big companies. That can apply as much as it can with political advisors. 2 more questions, Matthew. Thank you so much for your time. The first question, perhaps unfairly, is would you download it yourself in its current form?
I think, for me, I'd want to know a lot more about how it functions. Balancing against that, I think we all want to have some form of effective system. Yes. So that's one of the reasons why we're really, really hoping that we get the information before we're being asked to download it. So I'm hoping I won't have to make that choice.
Was that a politician's answer rather than a lawyer's?
I've got to say this. If you're faced with this or nothing...
Yes.
Then I'd probably be inclined to say, well, if this is the only option, this is the only option. But I wouldn't be comfortable with it, even if I decided to download it.
I think that's where I am. And with that added concern, of course, that the suspicion surrounding it will reduce its efficacy, even if people like you and me do download it with reservations. Which leads me neatly to the final question, which is where can people read your legal concerns? Where can they read the thing you've published?
It's on the website for Matrix, which is the barrister chambers I belong to. So it's on our website. We can give you information about it that you can send out. Also, if you follow me on Twitter, mriderqc, you'll see I've got a link to it there.
Perfect. I shall amplify that now. Thank you so much for your time. We have a little bit more space on this programme to talk to people like you for a little longer than is normal. So my apologies if that took you by surprise, but we're incredibly grateful for your insights and your inputs. 10:45, another reminder there from Matthew that social media reminds me at least, that one of the greatest indicators of absolute idiocy and quite often epic bigotry is people who aren't lawyers having QC on their profiles. But if you have achieved that lofty honour in the realms of the law, then quite right that you should have it there accurately and honestly. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Well, curiouser and curiouser. Do you know, as somebody involved in technology, how would you answer the question, do you think, in a way that doesn't add to the concerns and the suspicions? Why are we having a centralised version, whereas all the other countries, the kit does the work automatically, the technology does the work automatically, the government doesn't have to receive any information because the phone will contact the phone. I started off, I think, like Matthew Ryder, QC, I would probably still sign up for it with reservations, but my biggest reservation would be that if that data is being centralised, I don't think you need to be Mr. Suspicious to look at the people who might be getting their hands on it and look at what they've done in the not-too-distant past with data that people didn't realise was making its way into their grubby little hands. It's 10:46. Where there's something almost inspiring about our last guest and his talk of how sometimes you can't define everything by track record. It probably comes as a surprise to people who associate me with rabid opposition to the lunacy of Brexit and a deep distrust of the people responsible for sort of manipulating the country into it. But that doesn't mean that this app would necessarily be dodgy. And if it's the only option we've got, we would probably be wise to sign up to it. But this concern about why they need to harvest data is really, really big. And it's a concern that is, I'm afraid, built upon the track record of Dominic Cummings and co. It's not a concern that's arrived unprompted out of the blue. It's a concern that is built upon the fact that they have a record of doing this sort of thing. Speaking in rather vague legalese. So I don't know. I still think I would download it, but tell me either why you wouldn't or why you're concerned about something perhaps a little different. 10:50 is the time. Shall we have a quick catch-up with Theo Washwood? Ben in Worcestershire has been on hold for ages, Theo. I hope you appreciate his
keep it
patience.
Short and sweet. I'll keep
Carry
it short
on.
and sweet.
What's up? What's going on?
So Sir Patrick Vallance, who is the government's chief scientific advisor, has been appearing before MPs via Zoom. Those MPs, of course, from the Health Select Committee, questioning Sir Patrick Vallance about the government's response so far to COVID-19 and about what the plans are going forward in the next weeks and months. Interesting point Sir Patrick Vallance made in terms of children going back to school, saying that older children were more likely to spread COVID-19 by giving it to adults than younger children, and that raises the possibility that primary schools will be allowed to return first before secondary schools.
Very clear that children are at much lower risk of clinical disease and severe disease. So for severe disease, the evidence is absolutely clear that they are at very much reduced risk, not zero risk, but very, very much reduced risk. And there's also reasonable evidence to suggest they're lower risk of getting symptomatic disease as well, or clinically evident disease. So in terms of the effect on children, it's much, much lower. Do children become infected less? And there the evidence is less robust in terms of that. So overall, children are fine. They have less of a problem. Some, of course, do get a problem. Maybe they get infected a bit less. Maybe perhaps they reduce transmission, but we're absolutely not clear about that at the moment.
You were making the point earlier in your show, James, about face masks. The government's previously said that face masks didn't prevent the infection being spread. And of course, previously there's been a shortage of face masks. And now the government's saying, actually, face masks do make a difference. Sir Patrick Vallance made the point before MPs at the Health Select Committee that actually so much depended on how close an individual was to somebody else to determine whether the infection would in fact be transmitted.
A minute at 2 metres contact is about the same risk as 6 seconds at 1 metre. So that gives you some idea of why the 2 metres becomes important. And the risk at 1 metre is about 10 to 30 times higher than the risk at 2 metres. So the distancing is an important part of this.
So if I come up to you and I shake your hand, even if it's for only a moment or two and then walk away, that is much more likely to increase the risk than if we stand in a queue at 2 metres and you walk into the shop before me in terms of transmitting the disease.
I'm not being dozy, am I? That's a bit obvious.
It is obvious, but people have been asking about the 2 metre rule.
No, it's the numbers and the confirmation.
Social distancing and why we have to wait outside of supermarkets at 2 metres apace. So Patrick Vallance is trying to explain to MPs that where the modelling has come from, why they've come up with this decision, so that the public can understand better why the current rules and restrictions are in place at the moment and what needs to remain in place even when the lockdown is lifted or eased.
Yes, I see. So the big change on the face masks, but probably the clever money tells us that that's always had more to do with the size of the stockpile than with the so-called science.
Yes, because of course Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, before repeatedly said that face masks weren't necessarily going to be very effective in stopping the spreading of the infection. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, has previously advocated the use of face masks, and now the government has come round to the Mayor of London's thinking. Of course, in between times, the science hasn't necessarily changed, but the current, but the situation in terms of the availability of face masks is something that has changed, and there will be questions for the government as you've raised.
Well, yes and no, actually. Sorry, I'm being a bit pedantic here, but of course what Sadiq Khan recommended is to cover your face with anything you've got. Use a scarf, use something homemade, so that wouldn't have anything to do with stockpiles. It's yet more evidence of the absolute absence of clarity. And is it fair also to say that the scientific advice changed 2 weeks ago on this, but the government still hasn't issued any instructions or guidance reversing its original position that there was no point wearing anything at all.
So the government has yet to change that advice, but of course, more broadly, the advice in terms of going out, easing the lockdown hasn't changed yet. So it would be, one assumption could be that they will change that advice when people start to use public transport again and return to work and go about their daily business again. And that's essentially why they haven't changed their advice yet.
Right. That's very generous analysis, and thank you very much indeed. Theo Usherwood, LBC's political editor. I mean, the problem with this division that has been sown is how hard it must be for people with sort of Boris Johnson tea towels listening to this to persuade themselves that there isn't, you know, an epic unfolding here. Truly staggering to think that they're wanging around still on face masks. Have you heard about patient 30? Oh, I've left this poor fella in Worcestershire. He's probably fallen asleep or gone out for some permitted exercise. Let's talk to Ben. Ben, are you still awake? Are you still with us, Ben?
Yes, I am, James. Hi,
Well,
how are you doing? You're right.
Well, I'm all right, although I'm worried you won't be able to remember why you rang in.
No, I can remember, don't worry.
Go on, then.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the app, and I am actually surprised that the government haven't taken up Google and Apple's offer. Things have changed since 2016, obviously in loads of different ways, but one of the key ones is that in 2018, this is very dry in some ways, the General Data Protection Regulation program came in 2018, which sets out kind of key principles on how your data can be used.
Yeah.
So when you send your data over to a company or an organisation, I've worked in the tech sector and I've worked in local government as well.
Good.
There's something called purpose limitation. So when your data, this is one of the 7 principles, when you send your data to a company or a government, they must state what they're using that data for and the limits on how they're going to be using it. So they must tell you, we will be using the data for X, Y, and Z, and they must also say what they will not be using the data for. And they also must tell you how long that data is on the system for. So data can be held from anything from 6 months to 18 months. But
So I want to squeeze as much out of you in the short time available. So these are on 2 separate sides of the scale. You're confused about why they've gone down the centralised route, but you're also providing some words of reassurance that we may not have as much to worry about as some people fear.
Yes, I am. I will tell you the reason why I have concerns why the government aren't using of taking up Google and Apple's offer. So Germany, for example, even prior to this protection regulation, data protection regulation, which I would recommend listeners please, read up on, because it can protect you a lot. To be perfectly honest.
It's not as if people have got much else to do at the moment. If you're ever going to read up on data protection legislation, now is the time to do it. It's another lockdown silver lining. Carry on quickly. I'm short of time.
Exactly. Sure. So the reason that I'm concerned is because if Google, I think it just kind of invites more pressure on the on.
Yeah,
on
of course it does. Yeah.
Because
we zig while everybody else zags would be the glib way of putting it, perhaps.
Very key point that I just want to get in, James, about this is that the reason is if a private company infringes on this, if Google and Apple infringed on any of this, they would get fined 4% of their annual turnover.
Right, whereas if the government infringes upon it, it could end up in the same drawer as the Russia report. Unless somebody took the requisite legal action. Okay, I think I'm across this. Thank you for that. And again, even somebody who is cautiously supportive of it, the concerns just grow, don't they, with every call? More calls, I think, to come. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. It's 10:59. And here's the problem, right? So after an hour with some expert testimony on this question of the app, the app which will hopefully help us emerge from lockdown with minimum harm and casualty, here is the fundamental problem that I think everybody listening with good intention, everybody listening honestly, would have to agree with. Of course, you're welcome to call me if you don't. Why on earth, if the success of the app, the success of the entire project depends upon take-up, i.e. the more people that download it, the more effective it becomes, the more likely it is to succeed, why would the government introduce a version that we have already established, and I heard the last couple of calls to Nick's show as well, which I don't know how representative they were of the whole programme, but I mean, clearly this position was represented. Why would they bring in technology that invites mistrust? That's all. Whether the mistrust turns out to be justified or not is actually less pertinent. So this to me is a killer question. If I mean, it's right up there with why didn't care home patients get put into the Nightingale hospitals? And it's not even an if, we know that the more people who download this app, the more likely it is to succeed. I don't know for certain because I don't have the expertise, but I have been told that any take-up in excess of 50% would deliver a positive result, and if not half of the population takes it up, if less than half take it up, then it won't work. Again, that's something that we'd need to examine more closely. But the general truth, the broad observation, the more people who download it, the better it is, the more likely it is to work, I am afraid, again, leads to a question of cock-up competence or conspiracy. Why on earth would this government not bring in the app most likely to reassure the public? Or let me rephrase that slightly. Why on earth would the government bring in technology, the available technology, least likely to engender public trust? Why? It's just weird, right? So here is a selection of options. For the benefit of the tape, let's say there are two. You've got the Apple Google version, which is decentralized, which means all of the information never actually goes anywhere except your phone, and the phone uses that information to contact other phones to tell people if they have been in close proximity with somebody who has subsequently found to have tested positive. Even I, a bear of very little brain when it comes to matters technological, even I have got my head around this, although, as ever, if I've made any mistakes, ring me and rob me of my temporary self-satisfaction. So that's what happens. This government, the British government, I think at the moment uniquely, but again, if another government has done this, that could be reassuring. So give me a ring and tell me. This government has elected technology which sees all of our information potentially feed into a centralised location. Why? And then you add this extra facet, this extra dimension, which is, of course, if it is engendering mistrust, which I think it's fair to say it is, then it is actually less effective. For every single person who thinks, hang on a minute, I don't want them collecting my data, I don't want my data going into a central harvester. Anybody else think of the restaurants then? I don't want my data going to a harvester, even if it is an all-you-can-eat buffet. Shut up. I don't want my data going centrally, therefore I'm not going to download it. Every single person who arrives at that conclusion, and we've spoken to some today, actively reduces the likelihood of the whole scheme succeeding. There you go. That's not an opinion. That's an observation, I think. But as ever, you're welcome to challenge it. Matt's in Bristol. Matt, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi. I think we need to look at this from the point of view of what data is being gathered and why. I haven't gone into the depths of the Apple Google version, but let's say that works phone to phone, and basically it takes a record of who you've been close to using Bluetooth technology. Fantastic. If you then tell the app that you've developed symptoms or even that you've tested positive, it then tells other people's phones via the internet that they've been in close contact with somebody who has developed symptoms and they may wish to isolate. Now, if the government app could do that, and it could do that being a centralised app, But that is the only data it needs to gather is who you've been close to. It doesn't actually need to know where you are geographically. And the point I'm making is that if they're gathering more data than only who have I been in proximity to since I've had this app switched on, you have to ask the question, why are they gathering that data? Now, there may be perfectly legitimate reasons for it. So, for instance...
Or they're
there's an outbreak...
Forgive me, no, hang on, because you're cleverer than I am at this stuff, so I just need to slow you down a bit. Or they may not be. They may not be gathering any extra data. They may only be gathering the data about proximity.
Well, actually, that isn't really data gathering.
No.
To be honest. It is data gathering.
No, it is data gathering, but there's no...
in proximity within the last fortnight.
Precisely, yeah, that's data.
Yeah.
But there's no reason to fear, there's no actual reason to fear, apart from the reasons we've looked at, with the knowledge that we currently have, that they would be, even if it is centralised, that they would be collating anything in addition to smartphone X came into close contact with smartphones A, B, C, D, E, F and G, right?
Absolutely, completely. They don't need to know who you are.
But it's trust and faith.
Where you are. They just need to know that it's your phone. Now, I mean, they can tie that back to your mobile phone each phone is uniquely identifiable. They can tie it back to your mobile phone contract. But if they do that, they've got to tell you that they're doing that. And if they're gathering any more information, they've got to tell you why they're actually gathering that information, which is a point that your previous caller, one of your previous callers.
That's right.
I think.
So you're less worried than some of my other callers this morning?
Well, because of the reputation of the people who are
we're back to that. Can I ask briefly what you do for a living? Why do you know so much about it?
Scientist. I'm a data scientist.
Yeah, that'll do, Matthew. Carry on.
Yeah, so given the reputation, you have to ask the question: why aren't they using a decentralised app that everybody else is using? Yes,
and that's not tinfoil hattish or conspiracy theory. Yeah, that is based on observable evidence.
Why can't we in the UK just download that app anyway? Is it actually disabled within the United Kingdom?
No, well, this was the other fear. The other fear was that people might do that, wasn't it? I've read that this morning as well. I know you're asking it as a question, so we'll leave the question hanging. What do you mean? Well, because it would... it would split the scheme, wouldn't it?
That's fair enough. Yeah,
you'd voluntarily download the Google Apple version while the government was punting its own version, and surely... I mean, you're the data scientist, mate. I'm just a gob on a stick. But surely that would reduce the likelihood of...
absolutely right, yeah.
Good,
yeah.
Yes, okay. There you go.
They need 40% of they're saying that they need 40% of the population, which is 80% of smartphone users, which would be an awful lot of...
big ask, isn't it? Yes.
That is a big ask in order to have an effective system. And yeah, if you split that, even if you split that 50-50, I mean, there's no reason why you can't have both. But if you're not going to... I don't see any reason why you can't have both. It might use more battery power on your phone and you have to recharge it a bit more often. But, because it's leaving Bluetooth switched on all the time. But a lot of people have Bluetooth switched on all the time anyway.
Yeah, they do.
You don't want to go... I want to put something on my smart speaker. I don't go, I'll turn Bluetooth on now. You just leave it switched on. But,
yes.
Yeah, I don't see...
But there's a literacy here, though also... I worry about gaps. I mean, because we speak, and there's no criticism involved in this, we speak as if owning a smartphone and having lots of data is as natural as, having a doormat. But, of course, for a lot of people, it is still prohibitively expensive. That take-up rate is a worry, isn't it? That take-up rate really is a worry. But, yeah, you're right. Like everybody else, you would like to think there's nothing to worry about here, because theoretically you could make a case for saying there's nothing to worry about, but the track records of the people responsible leave you a little bit more concerned than you would have been otherwise, is probably the best way of putting it.
Yeah, the people who are now at the top have not left a legacy of use of data which would inspire trust, shall we say.
Very diplomatically put, very diplomatically put. And then almost as night follows day, someone's just sent me an article. Thank you, Matt. Take care. Matt, a data scientist there. someone's just sent me an article from the Metro yesterday evening. I'll read you the first sentence of it. The government's anticipated coronavirus tracing app has failed crucial security tests and is not yet safe enough to be rolled out across the UK, according to reports. So we'll have a look at those reports as well. But please don't forget, a lot of people are looking at our success and wondering how we did it. How would you sum it up if this was the other way round? If you were presenting the programme and I was sitting at home listening, what would you say now about what progress we've made together in the context of this app? There is genuine confusion about why the British government has elected to swim against the tide of proven international success, and by that I mean the kit that has been deployed in other countries has largely worked. I must tell you about Patient 31. It's a staggering story, absolutely staggering. Apologies if you've already heard it. So there's a lot of questions about why we would zig when everybody else is zagging, so to speak. But the big one, I'm afraid, is this issue of trust. And you have no idea how heavy my heart is when I remind you that I've been telling you now for the best part of 4 years, you can't just draw a line under things and get on with it or get over it or move on if the thing you're being asked to draw a line under involves a deception or a deceit or a manipulation, because you need to keep an eye on the people that did it. And that is, of course, the real problem here. It's a homemade problem. Why have you got a problem with this app? Well, because of the data. Why have you got a problem with the data? Well, because of the people that are in charge. So simply just remove that. You don't have to share the suspicions. For the record, I would still download it, but it's a swinging pendulum, so to speak. That would be the problem. So why have we got a problem here, Prime Minister? Well, it's because of me and my closest acolytes. It's basically because of my Vote Leave cabal and our slightly dodgy relationship with data collection. It turns out that a lot of the British public are a bit suspicious about us being involved in any form of data collection, to which anybody intelligent, and I stress again, I'm coming to this as an amateur, but surely anybody intelligent and honest would respond by saying very simply, well, is there any way that we can do what the app does without any centralised data collection at all? Even though we know we've got no intention at all of doing anything dodgy, the fact that people don't trust us will actually undermine the efficacy of the entire project, because we need a take-up rate that is huge, and we're only going to get that if we've got trust. So presumably there isn't any way we could do all this without the centralised data collection, otherwise that's what you would have done. To which they now have to reply by saying, well, no, actually every other country in the world that's deployed some sort of scheme like this has done it with an app that is decentralised, an app that doesn't involve any data harvesting or collection. Which leads me to this really uncomfortable conclusion. The government, probably the government most associated in the entire world at the moment, the government most associated and indeed most proven to have deployed data in obscure and potentially manipulative ways. That is our government now. That's the one we've got. The government which has form, more form than any other government on the planet in this very specific field. They are now telling the British people to sign up to something different from what everybody else has and vulnerable to suspicions that data might be used inappropriately again. Come on, riddle me that. Come on. I mean, at what possible point in the procrastinations would you have put your hand up and said, well, hang on, if people don't trust us, why don't we just give them an app that, A, everybody else is using, B, Google and Apple are behind it, so at least the technological clout is clear, and C, it won't admit any suspicions. That's the question that needs to be answered. That is the question that needs to be asked. If it's trust in Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, the whole of the electoral law-breaking Vote Leave leadership that is the problem here, if it is the shadow of Cambridge Analytica, the knowledge of how data was used, the bills that were paid to curious companies all over the shop, if that's the problem or part of the problem, plus the natural worries that you'd have even without this backdrop about surveillance, about Big Brother society, about government interfering too much or knowing too much about you. So you just mould those together like two fat chunks of plasticine. And to come out at the end of that and say, well, let's stick with the app that actually causes the suspicion, even though we don't have to, that's where I get confused. That's where I get really confused and a little bit concerned. But at 21 minutes after 11, I'd still download it because I don't see what I've got to lose. Jodie is in Uxbridge. Jodie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Jodie.
I've been hearing your former or earlier callers, and yes, trust is an issue. But what I look at in my research is a different angle, which is on the digital.
I'm just gonna try and improve your phone line, Jodie, and come back to you in a second. I promise you that we'll do our best. In the meantime, Barry is in Worksop. Barry, what did you want to say?
Oh, hi, James. I'm a bit concerned that there's no legislative process being put before us to explain what they're going to do with the app. And Australia suffers the same problem of mistrusting government control of data. The government in Australia put down a very simple law which says the data from the app cannot be accessed by third parties. It can only be used by the health service workers. It cannot be accessed by warrant, so it removes it from the UK equivalent of RIPA access. Yes. And then it goes on to say that the app can't be used by employers or any operator to say you can and cannot come to work, or you can or cannot enter our shopping centre unless your phone has this app on. And to me, that's one of the things that the government's not published, at least, that they're not going to put in place very strict controls on the data and where the data goes, but also on what people can say about you if you don't have the app on your phone. It's a bit concerning.
Didn't the lad the data scientist addressed some of these concerns? I think he suggested that the legislation might already be in place, perhaps looking at the issue from a slightly different angle to the one you've adopted, but arriving at the same conclusion, because he said it is there, but I still worry about the personnel involved.
I think he's right. He's very right. I'd agree with him. He's very right in the law in terms of the data when the data gets into a server. But we know that we've got the RIPA regulations here, which give access to third parties, and third parties in the government is the government. So that's one concern. But my bigger element of this is, where's the process that says my employer can't force me to have the app on my phone? Where's the process that says I cannot be required by the police to present a phone to show I've got the app on it?
No. Oh, I see what you mean, because it's not compulsory, but if you were to say you can't come to work tomorrow unless you've got the app, that would be... forgive me, and I'm going to ask you the question, and if it strikes you as unfair, then say so. But is that really what we should be worrying about at the moment, Barry?
Well, it's what was clearly, and bear in mind Australia was a few weeks ahead of us, that's what was bothering the Australian government. It was an objection by the public, and so they moved, whether it's a real objection or not, but they moved to quench that objection by putting it into law to say this, basically reinforcing the app is purely and only for protection and collection of data and tracing. It is not for any other purpose. And you cannot be... you cannot become a third party, third world person just because you don't have the app on your phone. Doesn't appear to be any attempt to put any regulation around it to give us certainty that it is only for the purpose they're currently saying. Yeah, but again,
5 years ago I wouldn't even have had these worries, would you, Barry? I just wouldn't crossed my mind that a British establishment or government or whatever you want to call it would indulge in these big brotherish type manipulations. It just wouldn't have been a worry for me. I'd have said, come off it, Barry, it's not North Korea, but I worry now about the stuff you described. Would you have worried 5 years ago?
Well, personally, I've always worried about the harvesting of data, be it government or third parties. I'm probably more concerned about harvesting of data by third parties, to be honest.
Yeah, but fair enough.
It just feels that there isn't, I still feel that the government could make their case simpler if they actually said, look, we are going to protect this data by specific regulations so that we cannot,
But they don't even need to do... Yeah, but that this is chicken and egg, isn't it? Because my question is, why don't you just introduce the app that doesn't admit any of these fears?
Well, I think Australia faced the same argument in that, but people were still saying that, well, even if the app isn't centralised, it still doesn't stop my employment.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I said that. That's why I asked whether or not this is really what we should be worrying about now. And so I understand your point and your description of second-class citizens and the notion of coercion, even if it wasn't legally sanctioned. It would be one of those, well, all right, it's my way or the highway type coercions. I do completely understand that. But your other concerns, particularly about third-party access, would be addressed, I think, and indeed diffused by simply signing up to what Google and Apple have done, or to what other countries have already employed.
Yeah, I'm not totally unaware of how the Google and Apple app work in the background, so I can't comment whether that data goes anywhere.
Well, simply decentralised versus centralised, isn't it?
Yeah, but there must be at some point for my phone to communicate with another phone, there must be some data transfer somehow, and I don't want to sort of suggest that it's going to be picked up. But I don't have a personal concern about the...
But the only data that would be transferred, would be your phone has been near my phone at some point in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, but if you're the other side...
I can live with that.
By then, how's the data going to get there?
Well, I'm not worried about that. That's just a small quibble that you describe. It's not a massive problem. The only data will be your phone's been near my phone in the last couple of weeks, and the only person that gets it are the people that I've been near in the last couple of weeks. All of the fears and the concerns, or 90% of the fears and the concerns that we're hearing today, are contingent upon the government being a middleman in this process. And 90% of the fears about the government being a middleman in this process are built upon the people, the actual individual named people in the government.
Oh, yes, I agree.
And their track record.
It seems peculiarly odd that, given that Germany made the decision to stop going towards their central database and go for the Google distributed one before the NHS group announced their process, it does appear to be questionable. But I'm still concerned that, irrespective of which app is put in place, I think there needs to be some legislative process to calm the waters, to say it will not be abused either. And they don't want to, probably, or don't...
But the people, but the thing is, no, it's a great call, Barry, and I do understand exactly what you're saying, but I don't think some, not all, but I don't think some of the people, many of the people who are suspicious of the people involved would actually be reassured by legislation. I mean, with Cummings, you're talking about a man who was found to be in contempt of Parliament. There is no fully formal or codified reason to suggest that they would act anything other than honourably, but you can't really quibble with people who are a little bit suspicious of that in this case, particularly with Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings. We're looking for honourableness, humility, honesty, clarity and transparency and accountability.
Yeah, well, I think each of them have got a few of those attributes, but not all of them, unfortunately.
Sounds a bit like Eric Morecambe and Andre Previn there, Barry, playing all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. Thank you, mate. It's a big one, this. It's really huge, and it gets bigger inevitably. When I read in the Health Service Journal that, well, let's get the quote right. It is being unrolled, of course, on the Isle of Wight as we speak, I think, or certainly imminently, and it would appear that app has indeed failed to test. The Health Service Journal, which has really led the line in this, and should be at the press conference, they should be asking the first question every day instead of political correspondence. The new contact tracing app so far failed tests needed to be included on NHS App Store. Technology to be trialled on Isle of Wight this week ahead of national rollout. Concerns that public trust could be lost if privacy concerns not taken seriously. It's, it's like night following day, isn't it? It's so far failed the tests that needed to be included in the NHS app library. The Health Service Journal understands. So again, if that is clarified or indeed refuted in any meaningful way, then we'll tell you immediately. Senior NHS sources told the Health Service Journal it had thus far failed all of the tests required for inclusion in the app library, including cybersecurity, performance and clinical safety, none of which would matter as much if I wasn't also now compelled to tell you, according to the latest tweet from LBC, that the United Kingdom now has... God, I could weep. I really could. We now have the highest death toll in Europe, second only to America. It's an odd thing to say to you, but we do worry a little bit, Ava and I, the producer of this programme, about the diet of conversation that we have. I really worry about it a lot, because I don't think it would be helpful to anybody. And I especially feel this when I come off air on a Thursday and we've just spent an hour doing Mystery Hour, usually with a load of children. There's no point me coming on the radio every single morning and shouting at you about the death toll. There's no point me coming on the radio every single morning and just counting corpses, because you would stop listening to this programme and I would quite possibly go mad. But the milestones, you can't look away from the milestones. And we're now the worst in the whole of Europe, despite having those warnings, those alarm bells that were sounded on the other side of the world as long ago as January, and just, you know, a hop, skip and a jump across the water as recently as February, as long ago as February, the month in which Boris Johnson elected to take a fortnight's holiday. And we've now got the worst death toll in Europe. At what point do the increasingly desperate and pathetic attempts to portray this government's performance as anything other than catastrophic stop? Just in all honesty, by all that is decent, how many people do we have to bury before everybody recognises that a lot of those people didn't have to die? Even I began to get a bit tired of mentioning Germany all the time. And you'd say to me, well, if it was the other way around, James, they'd be shouting it from the rooftops. And I'd say, I'm not really sure that's the point, you know? And you can see what they're doing next. They're already putting it in place. Oh, now is not the time. Well, when is the time? Now is not the time for well, when then? When is the time? When will the government give me permission to scrutinise the government? When will be an appropriate time to ask just how many dead people would still be alive today if the political response had been different and the political leadership has been present? I don't know, because it's just happened, and I'm very, very, very conscious of the burdens that we all carry at the moment, but, you know, I'm getting paid for this, so I'm more conscious of the burdens that you carry, perhaps, than any that I may be required to do so, because that's my job. But does that change it for you? The fact that, and this day has been coming for a while now, but it's now formal, it's now confirmed, feels like a lifetime ago, but it was only a couple of months that we were talking most days about the situation in Italy. We were taking calls from Italian-based from listeners in Italy. There you go. Not a complicated concept, really. And they were telling us, it is, what is it now, 6 weeks since I read you that message from my friend in Gran Canaria saying, what on earth are you doing in that country? And still they say, oh, yes, a lot of people are asking us about our success. And when they realise that won't wash, well, now is not the time to ask these questions. And if you are a critic of the fact that we have the biggest death toll in the country, then they'll be going through your bins as I speak, looking for any old Jeremy Corbyn badges or evidence that you might have once voted for the Labour Party. As if that matters. Secretary of State for Culture writing to the BBC at the weekend, without a single substantive complaint about that Panorama programme. Not a single word of challenge to anything that the medics on that programme said, but expressing displeasure about the fact that they have not pledged allegiance to the Conservative Party before agreeing to appear upon the programme. That's how I read it, of course. They phrased it slightly differently and said that they should have declared that these people have political allegiances to the Labour Party. Although quite what that means in the current climate, I haven't got a Scooby-Doo. If you were a big Ed Miliband fan, it's quite possible that you would have considered Jeremy Corbyn to be the worst thing that's happened to the Labour movement since it started. So what does that even mean? But it doesn't matter, does it? Because everything about these people is about evading responsibility. They're playing with the country as if it were a train set. That speech haunts me, you know. 4 days after the whole mess started, 4 days after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, and Boris Johnson was talking about one country needs to go in a different direction, to step into the phone box as Clark Kent and come out as Superman. I still don't really understand what he was talking about. Although, it's perfectly possible he didn't really either at the time. But here we are now, biggest death toll in Europe, and what are we supposed to do with that? How hard do you have to tug your forelock to pretend that that doesn't matter? How hard do you have to tug your forelock to pretend that this doesn't matter? And of course, I know better than anybody what the problem is. The problem is that some of us have been screaming for years what these people were like, and you screamed back that they weren't. So you can't, can you, contemplate yet the possibility or just the scale of how wrong you were? I don't care. There's no shame involved, no humiliation or embarrassment. We all make mistakes. But now, if you're not prepared to admit at least a mistake of trust, then you've got the job of explaining to yourself, because I don't really want to hear it, explaining to yourself why the largest death toll in Europe isn't evidence of the worst response. 20 minutes to 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Now is not the time. Now is not the time for asking why we've got the largest death toll in Europe, second only to America. And America is getting worse and worse and worse and worse because of the man in charge. They're now speculating or modelling 3,000 deaths a day by next month. 3,000 deaths a day. Remember when he said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose a single vote? I don't think anyone quite envisaged him presiding over 3,000 deaths a day and still somehow banking on the support of... How do you describe people now? How do you describe people that are still following these sort of political leads? How many people have to die before you decide that actually being given permission to be vile about Muslims and just a little bit more racist than you were allowed to be 10 years ago? How many people have to die before the thrill of that permission, the thrill of that invitation, the bank robbers, the letterboxes, oh, yes, he can. How many people have to die before being able to say what you like about Muslims and seeing racism move back into the mainstream ceases to be a great comfort to you, ceases to be a price worth paying for putting these people in power? And of course, you don't need me to remind you what's going to happen at the end of this year. 50,000 people currently being hired to handle all the paperwork that we're going to have to do as a result of voting to get rid of red tape and bureaucracy. Same people, same problem, but now people are dying on a scale greater than anywhere else in Europe. And those are the ONS figures, remember? Those are the ONS figures. When you look at what the Financial Times is doing with the modelling, we moved to the front of this pack months ago. Christian's in Thanet. Christian, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi there, James. Thanks for taking my call.
Hello, mate.
Fan. Just listening to you there, just before I go on to what I wanted to speak about, which was the app. There's a term in psychology called escalation of commitment, which I think perfectly encapsulates that type of thinking when faced with growing evidence and supporting evidence against your idea.
Yes.
Actually, it's very much in the human condition to double down on the original idea instead of accepting, hold on, I might be wrong. It's happened throughout history, most classically, obviously, recently with Brexit, but also military operations of the US that had been catastrophic failures. It's just one of those weird things that when faced with evidence, you'd think the logical thing to do would be, I'm wrong, I need to reevaluate, and you would hope that that was what someone would do. However, it's very much in the on the other end of the spectrum. People double down. It's
and we could all do it. I know this isn't why you rang in. I'm not completely unfamiliar with the phenomenon, but we're all capable of it. Every single one of us is capable of it.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Myself included.
Yeah, same here.
Very much when I'm faced with challenges to my ideas and perceptions of the world, it takes a lot for me to have an open mind about it and then go, oh, maybe I was wrong. But yeah, escalation of commitment. It's a term in psychology that is used to describe exactly what you were talking about. It's very interesting to read about. But the reason I called was just on the back of what was being spoken about with the app that's rolling out. I mean, you asked earlier, and my apologies if this has already been answered, but
Go on.
if there were any other countries that have chosen this centralised app route, to the best of my knowledge, the only other countries that we have doing that at the moment are France and Japan. And
They have, so they're doing the same sort of thing.
They are doing.
Okay, well that's encouraging to me. That's encouraging to me. I don't, whether it should be or not, I don't know, but I'll take whatever I can find at the moment.
Of course, I think we all would. Personally speaking, it doesn't do a lot for me.
Right.
The reason, I can't give you a reason why they have opted for this, other than, in my understanding of the process and the system, that it makes it easier, far easier, to analyse the data that is being collected. Because if you imagine, in the very simplest terms, centralised systems are, in its very nature, centralised to a server, centralised database. It is in one place. So that data comes from our phones. It is stored in one place. Now, as much as I despise this current government, to use a kinder word, I don't buy into conspiracy, and I don't.
Nor do I yet. Nor do I.
No, I mean, I think there's far too many people would need to keep a secret. It's not. But it's.
But here's the problem. Here's a really good little tweet that cuts straight to the heart of what you are saying, I think, and what the actual problem is, because I don't think that they would, and people can laugh at me for that and say that I'm naive, or how much evidence do you need, but I follow this stuff more closely than most, and I just don't think they could or would do it. But the fact that people won't trust the technology precisely because of who is telling them to download it means that they should look for technology that doesn't admit the suspicions. I just want to find you this tweet before you go, because it's from a guy called Luke who's listened to the programme for years. You'd struggle to find a less tin-hatty conspiracy nut than me. But if you think I'm downloading an app that gives Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson my data, then you're absolutely insane. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not his fears are well-founded. All that matters is that his decision not to download it damages the entire project. The entire project. The integrity of the entire project. It makes it less likely to work. The more people that don't download it, the more, well, the less likely it is to work. I told you that if that Health Service Journal story was challenged, or if the story did move on, then we'd bring it to you immediately, and so we shall. The Department for Health has issued a statement saying this story is factually untrue. The NHS COVID-19 app has not failed any clinical assessments, and NHS Digital has been clear it will go through the normal assessment and approval process following the Isle of Wight rollout. Privacy and security have been paramount through the app's development, and we have worked in partnership with the National Cyber Security Centre throughout. The app uses low-energy Bluetooth, not GPS, and therefore it does not track people's locations. To which you can only respond by saying, well, thank God for that. It doesn't address the concerns we've been hearing all morning, but it does, of course, address the fears that the technology itself wouldn't be fit for purpose. And, of course, that is a statement from the Department for Health. As I said to you when I read out the story from the Health Service Journal in the Metro last night, if the facts are challenged, if the story moves, we'll bring it to you immediately, because that's all I can do at times like this. Ask the questions that need to be asked, and the less comfortable they are, the more important it is to ask them, and bring you the news, the facts, the developments, the claims, the counterclaims as they happen. Because this isn't a story. This isn't a period of British history where you should be on one side or the other. This is where every single person in the country should be concerned about one thing and one thing only. How many dead people shouldn't have died? It's 11:48. Do not adjust your sets, but Gavin Williamson has said something quite sensible, I think, the Secretary of State for Education, acknowledging that children, it's not the same. There is no substitute for being in a classroom. Do you know, the sympathy I've got for teachers trying to navigate this scenario from scratch with practically no precedent whatsoever. is immense in every sector, in every school. But I think Gavin Williamson is right. Certainly looking at my children who, quite frankly, if I didn't have conclusive biological evidence that they were mine, their attitude to schoolwork would make me wonder whether I had actually played a part in their conception. But they're up for it, and they're, doing their level best, but it's not the same. Not least because the cat might wander into the room, as Ian Hislop discovered on Have I Got News For You last week. The cat might, and that would never happen in a television studio any more than it would happen in a classroom. To give you a really low-level example of why I think he's right, there's so much going on at home, and it's not the environment in which working works. They've just issued the announcement of my next book, and I'm struggling with it because my normal environments are so different. You normally knuckle down here and you do that there, and it's dodgy. So we'll get onto that in the next hour, looking at the schooling, looking at children, talking to parents and to teachers about how worried you are. Or we did silver linings yesterday, and one of the biggest was, of course, the amount of time that we're getting to spend with our children in ways and on a scale that we don't usually, but we'll have a look at the schooling element of it, I think, after 12 o'clock today. Let's go back to Uxbridge. We've got Giotti back on the line. What were you planning to say to me, Giotti, before you were so rudely interrupted by me?
That's all right, and thank you for taking my call. But James, I do research on the digital divide.
Oh, yes.
And what it is that I was wondering, well, they are going to bring the app out, and very good, we can get it. But there are groups out there that will not be able to get access to the app because, well, they don't really understand technology itself. They could be, or they can't afford to get the device. So how are they going to get the app? So I know you've been talking a lot about trust today. That is there. But you also have to think of access, and there are issues such as cost, as how to get the device, and also, well, if you are in a rural area, it could be that broadband connections are either very low or not there. So how are you going to get access to this? These are the kind
of...
Yeah,
you're the Yes, no, and I mean, I think we could probably all think of somebody who doesn't have a smartphone, regardless of what our socio-economic status is. It may be a generational thing. It may be, somebody who has decided, actually someone incredibly famous who and incredibly rich, I know, doesn't have a smartphone because he doesn't like to be contactable all the time, and he likes to take away the temptation of plugging into social media. So he got himself an old-fashioned Nokia, and that's part of the point, isn't it?
This is exactly it, because actually we are finding that people, many are actually leaving smartphones now. They don't like the intrusion, perhaps, or too many features in it. And that's why people are abandoning them and going back to the old-fashioned ones. And so how are we going...
Not that many people, but yes, some people. And the other problem, of course, is how few people, how many people need to not be doing it for the whole thing to be undermined? I think we probably need to know that, don't we, before we make any other conclusions or frame our optimism versus our pessimism. Because would you download it yourself, just out of interest?
I wouldn't download it initially. I would wait to see. I'm not a first mover advantage person. I'm more risk averse, so I would be waiting to see exactly what is happening, and also just to find out what is the performance, like what other people might be saying about it, and then maybe take it on. I'm not just going to go out.
But then the sooner you do it, the better for all concerned. So, you see, I've got this weird sense that today with this particular subject of deep sympathy and understanding for people whose suspicions are built upon the identity. That tweet about, if you think I'm sending anything to Johnson and Cummings, you can think again. I get that. I completely get that. But I would download it on day one myself, I think, because the more people that download it, the more likely it is to have a beneficial impact. And I don't feel any fear of my data being used in any way against me. But that's not going to be a great comfort to anybody else, is it? It's a really, really strange one.
I wouldn't be looking at the data and trust issues, but it would be more about okay, how usable is it? The features and do I really understand them or don't I? And then taking it from there, because I've got friends in other countries who sent me links even to some websites in some countries where they're trying to identify whether you might have had COVID-19, and then telling you, well, maybe you don't go out and all. I've been trying these out. So this is why I said I would want to test it out, and then I'd go ahead. I'm not just going to go out there and get it there.
Yeah, I understand that as well. I mean, it doesn't lend itself, does it, to the usual pick a side, tie your scarf around your neck as tightly as you can and start lobbing rotten tomatoes at each other. There's no doubt some people still are, but I don't think anybody sensible will be, even with the sort of double-down psychology that was explained to us by Christian a moment ago. It's coming up to 11:57. Chris is in Winstead, I think, in Cheshire. Chris, what would you like to say? Let's try Gerald in Salisbury. Gerald, what would you like to say? Well, we may never find out. We seem to be having some technological issues ourselves. Hopefully we'll get a statement from the Department of Health in a minute telling us that we're not. That would be very encouraging. 11:57 is the time. What should we do? Let's try Gerald in Salisbury. Gerald, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First-time caller.
You're very welcome.
I personally have issues with sharing information with Google. I mean, they already have our location information on our phone.
You wouldn't be, you see.
Sorry, say again.
You wouldn't. That's my lesson today, is that we wouldn't be sharing information with Google. So on their app, which is decentralized, the phone records our contact on our actual phone, and then when we activate it, it sends a pings a message to everybody we've been close to, simply to tell them you've been close to someone who's now been tested for it and has got it. Nothing gets sent to Google at all. That's the whole point of the concerns that our guest, I think you may have missed. Yeah. One of the barristers, if you get onto my Twitter account, it's at the top of my feed, the barrister Matthew Ryder at the very near the top of the programme explained that.
I heard him, yeah.
Well, then you're not sending anything to Google.
At some point, they've got to correlate that we actually have tested positive for COVID-19.
Well, Google don't. Not with Google. I mean, the Office of National Statistics is counting how many people have got it and died of it. But this would simply be, and this is what I've learnt today. And as ever, you know, I could have got the wrong end of the stick. One of us has, but I think it's you on this occasion. The data is stored on your phone and used only when activated by you to tell everybody you've come close to that you've got it. Therefore, they should get a test or even consider isolating. And that is, I think, why you are wrong to be worried. And that's the other thing, the other point that Matthew made so brilliantly was that there are lots of reasons to be worried about what companies like Google and Apple are doing with data. But we shouldn't let that cloud our response to this specific episode, this specific story. I buy that.
I mean, the other point I would like to make as well, though, is some of the places where I go to work, because I'm a independent software IT contractor, some of the sites I go on to, we are instructed to turn our Bluetooth connections off because there are genuine concerns about the vulnerabilities of Bluetooth. So I have
that sounds like a more valid concern for another day. I don't know that it would be big enough as an issue to affect the efficacy of the whole project, but yeah, it's something to be aware of. But the central point about sending stuff to Google, I don't think is something we need to worry about. The time now is 12 noon.